and it's not as if it really improved, and it's not as if it, and it didn't exactly get much better and it didn't exactly get much better. At the end of the race, he ended up finishing over a minute behind his teammate. He ended up finishing over a minute behind his teammate Mick Schumacher, having obviously been right behind him at the safety car restart, which was only 28 laps from the finish. That means he was on average over 2 seconds a lap slower than his teammate. That sort of pace. Now I know he hasn't had much time in the Haas. I know he's not had much time in the car. I know he hasn't had that much time in the. I know he hasn't had that much time in the car. But this was a man with the sole intention of finishing the race. But this was a man with the sole intention of finishing the race. But this was a man with the sole intention of finishing the race. But this was a man with a sole intention of finishing the race, and not too bothered with it, and not too bothered about anything else. And boy, did it show. Anyway, at the other end of the grid, Max Verstappen made an incredible start that took him into the lead of the race at the first. That took him into the lead of the race. Now, firstly, Max Verstappen started in not first. Now, Max started in secondary gear. Firstly, he started in not first gear. He started in second gear, which is pretty rare in Formula 1. But the objective is obviously to reduce wheel spin, which is more likely on a wet surface. And using second gear and starting with second gear was enough to put him alongside Hamilton. From here, neither of them really know how late they can brake into turn 2. In the end, Hamilton brakes slightly later, but Max sees this and deliberately lifts off the brake in order to ease himself, in order for him to edge in front of Hamilton. Hamilton then sees this and does the same thing himself. But Verstappen then does it again right before they go into turn 2 to ensure that he is ahead and that Hamilton's forced onto the curb, hence losing his front wing. Getting front wing damage as a result. This piece of driving from Verstappen is a perfect example that it's not always about how late you brake. And had he not done this, had Verstappen not made this superb start, I'm fairly sure he would not have won this race. But anyway, it's not as if that. But in hindsight, it's not as. But in hindsight, But in hindsight, that damage wouldn't actually matter for Hamilton, as he'd end up replacing his front wing anyway due to this. As he'd end up replacing his front wing anyway due to this. Now at this point in the race, both Verstappen and Hamilton have just pitted for slick tyres, and Hamilton was gaining on Verstappen due to Verstappen having to lap these two cars. Now Lewis not wanting to lose any time. Hamilton is gaining on Verstappen due to Verstappen having lost time lapping these two cars. And Hamilton not wanting to do the same thing gets impatient and deviates from the racing line in order to try and pass Russell as quickly as possible. But as we saw, but when you're on slick tyres, going onto the wet. But when you're on slick tyres, going onto the water is generally not a very good idea, as we saw. Russell could have done a better job at moving out of the way, yes, but Hamilton still shouldn't go diving in like that. Now, from there he still tries to make the corner. And from there he still tries to make the corner. And from there he still tries to make the corner. But that was his. And from there, his second mistake was from there, still trying to make the corner. In hindsight, what he should have done was actually turn the other way. Obviously, this is quite obviously slower than actually making the corner. Now obviously this is slower than making the corner. But there is a lot more room for him to do so. But there is a lot more room, and you can guarantee that he would have had enough space to turn back round and carry on. But given that Hamilton is sitting on the floor of an F1 car, but given that Hamilton is in cockpit view, probably can't see any of this. But then again, given that Hamilton is in the cockpit, probably can't see any of this. And even if he could, the adrenaline of trying to make up for his mistake probably would have taken over anyway. And I fully realise that it's very easy. And I fully realise that it's very easy for me. And I fully realise that it's very easy for me to say. And I fully realise that it's very easy for me to say this. With the benefit of hindsight, a clear view. With the benefit of hindsight, a clear view, an overhead shot. With the benefit of hindsight, a clear view. With the benefit of hindsight, a clear view in front of me, an overhead shot clearly showing how much space there is, and not sitting in a Formula 1 car and instead on my sofa next to two mouldy pens and a half-eaten sandwich. Next to two mouldy next to 2 mouldy pens and a half-eaten sandwich. Next to 2 mouldy pens next to 2 mouldy pens and a half-eaten sandwich. Next to 2 mouldy pens and a half-eaten sandwich. So I can So of course I will let so of course I can let so I can absolutely so I can absolutely let so I can absolutely let him off. So I can absolutely let so obviously I can absolutely let him off this mistake. But from here I don't really know. But from here he drives into the barriers. Honestly, I don't really know what he's doing here. I don't know if he's I don't know if he thinks he has enough space. I don't know if he thinks he has enough space. But it's pretty clear from the outside that he doesn't. And surely it's got to be pretty clear from his point of view as well. And given that he's right next to the barriers, surely it's got to be pretty clear from his point of view as well. But the irony in all this is that had he not damaged his front wing, he would have been. But the irony of all this is, had he not damaged his front wing, he probably would have been around Bottas and Russell, which, as we saw, it got pretty spicy between those two. Which, as we saw, got pretty spicy between those two. And as we saw, it ended up getting pretty spicy between those two around that time. But before I talk about that, I just want to highlight one other piece of skill that Verstappen used to. Before I talk about that, I just want to highlight one more piece of skill that Verstappen used in order to secure this victory. The rule concerning mistakes in F1, the rule concerning mistakes in a neutralised race is following. If you spin off the track in the formation lap, you're allowed to regain any positions that you lost. Then you are allowed to regain any positions that you lost. Unless you drop right to the back. Unless you drop to last place. Which is why when Charles Leclerc when Charles Leclerc spun off in his tractor, he was able to regain those positions. He was allowed to regain those positions that he lost and not receive a penalty. However, when Sergio Perez was too busy thinking about how he would kidnap Roscoe instead of keeping his car on the track, he regained both of his positions and was penalised. He was he regained both of his positions and was given a penalty. But that rule is not the case. But if you're under safety car, then that rule is not the case. If you spin off the track, if your car goes all four wheels off the racetrack, then any car that overtakes you in that time is allowed to keep that position. So when Sergio Perez was too busy thinking about how to kidnap Roscoe than keeping his car on the track, and he regained those positions, he was given a penalty. From a guy as experienced as Checo is, this is actually a pretty poor mistake. Although if we're talking about people called Perez making bad decisions, I think he was somewhat overshadowed. Although if we're talking about people called Perez making bad decisions, I think he was slightly overshadowed. Although if we're talking about people called Perez making bad decisions, I think he was a little bit overshadowed. I think he was kind of overshadowed. The reason I bring this up is because his teammate Max Verstappen almost did the same thing in the safety car restart. The reason I bring this up is because his teammate Max Verstappen almost did the same thing when they restarted the race after the red flag. However, Verstappen. While Verstappen at turn 2 lifted off the brake to. While Verstappen in turn 2 lifted off the. While Verstappen deliberately lifted off the brake in turn 2 to edge himself in front of Hamilton, he actually did the opposite here. He deliberately kept his foot on the brake. In order to keep one wheel just about inside the track, meaning that Leclerc would not be allowed to overtake him. And while he was 4 wheels outside the track, it was only for a split second, and Leclerc realistically couldn't have reacted in that time. And it was probably impossible for Leclerc to react in that time. And in that time, it was pretty much impossible for Leclerc to react in time. But nonetheless, it was very good to see the racing between. Who, in my opinion, are the three best. Between these three drivers, who, in my opinion, are the best three. Who, in my honest opinion, are the three best youngsters right now in Formula One. In my honest opinion, are right now the three best youngsters in Formula One. And yes, I am including Lando Norris in that. A lot of people are saying that he's A lot of people are saying that he's massively stepped up. A lot of people are saying that he's taken a big step up. A lot of people are saying that he's taken a big step from last year to this year. And honestly, I disagree with that. And honestly, I disagree with that. And honestly, I disagree with that. I think Lando's. I think Lando's always. I honestly think Lando's always been at. I honestly think Lando's always been at this level. We just haven't realised it. I honestly think Lando's always been at this level. We just haven't realised it. Let's not forget that Lando Norris came into F1 as a 19-year-old rookie. Let's not forget that Lando Norris came into F1 as a 19-year-old rookie. Let's not forget that Lando Norris came into Formula 1 as a 19-year-old rookie. And across 2 years, pretty much matched Carlos Sainz, who and across 2 years at McLaren pretty much matched, and across his first 2 years pretty much matched Carlos Sainz, who for me is one of the most underrated drivers on the grid.